Hey guys, welcome to the first class. I'm gonna go very slowly and do small, short videos with very little information per video. I think that's probably the best way to learn so I don't overwhelm anybody. When I taught this class, the majority of the students were using something like this. But if you're not, it's fine. The principles are all the same. The only thing that might be a little bit different is some of the buttons or some of the controls. You may not have the control over your camera that I do with this one, but that's fine. The principles are the same and it'll still teach you something, I hope. So let's get started. The first thing I always teach people, I have a cat, because of course I do, come on. The first thing I always teach people is about the exposure triangle. Okay, so exposure triangle. It's three basic things that your camera uses to get a good picture. So there's shutter speed, aperture size, and ISO. And those three things need to be in some sort of balance in order to get a nice picture that's well exposed. And by that I mean not too light and not too dark. I'll start with shutter speed. So your camera is built where there's digital cameras at least, at the back of the camera, there's a sensor. That's what records the image by, like when the light hits it, that's how it records it. So when you're not actively taking a picture, you need to block the light, and that's what the shutter does. When you hit your shutter button, the shutter opens, it exposes the sensor to the light. When you're finished taking your picture, the shutter closes again, and that's when you move on to the next picture. While that shutter is open, the longer it's open, the more light is getting in, which is a good thing because it means a lighter, brighter picture, but it's a bad thing too. The longer it's open, things are moving. My hair is moving, the trees are moving, my phone is moving. Everything is just tiny little bits of movement. So the longer that shutter is open, all of that movement gets recorded as blur. So what you need to know about shutter is it's usually measured in fractions of a second. So you're gonna see, for example, like 1/60th of a second is sort of a typical shutter speed. 1/250th of a second might be a shutter speed you would do outdoors in a bright situation. You're not going to see anything like 1 second or 2 seconds unless you're taking a really slow exposure on purpose. If you're not doing it on purpose, you're going to get a whole lot of blur. Shutter speed is also really important when you're thinking about anything that's moving fast. You're going to want a faster shutter speed, but also zoom. If you're using a lot of zoom in your camera, if you have it built in, or if you're using a zoom lens, the more you're zoomed out, the more your camera is going to appear to shake. So the more blur you're going to get. So you need to have a faster shutter speed for that as well. A standard rule of thumb is if you're hand holding a camera like this with no support, like no monopod, no tripod, you don't want to go any slower than 1/60th of a second. If your camera or your lens has vibration reduction or shake reduction, then you might be able to get away with a little bit slower than that. There's always sort of exceptions to the rule. If you are zooming out, so for example, this lens has 18 to 250 on it. If I'm zoomed out to 250, rule of thumb is that I'm going to want to be at least 1/250th of a second. And that's at least. If you can go a little bit faster than that, all the better. But again, faster just means you're going to let in less light. You might not be able to. Your picture might end up too dark. But then you can adjust one of the other settings. So let's go to the second point of the triangle. So that would be aperture. The aperture is in the lens, and it's what you can see through. It's the hole in the lens. That's as simple as I can make it. It changes size though. So you can either change that, or sometimes if the camera doesn't have manual modes, the camera will do it for you. The wider your aperture is, the more light is going to get in. It's just like your pupils. It's just like a window. Bigger window is going to let in more light. Tiny little window, it's going to let in less light. So if you're in a situation where it's dark, if you're indoors, if it's coming on nighttime, you might want a really large aperture to let in a lot of light. Aperture has a secondary effect. So when you see those pictures that have a really blurry background and the subject is in focus and everything in behind it and in front of it are really, really blurry, that's because of the aperture. So the bigger the aperture, the more blur you're going to get behind and in front of your subject. It's called depth of field. So a shallow depth of field means that only your subject is in focus and everything in front of it and behind it is going to be blurry. A really deep depth of field means that everything from the camera to infinity is going to be in focus. So that is all controlled by aperture. It's kind of complicated reason, but it's really cool. And if you want to know what it is, let me know, because I'd love to explain it, but I'm not going to overwhelm anybody. So aperture changes depending on your lens. You can get lenses that have even bigger apertures. You can get lenses that are made for all sorts of very specific things. If you are doing something, say, like a portrait, you might hear of a portrait lens or even portrait setting on your phone. What that does is it makes your subject in focus. Everything behind and everything in front is going to be blurry. It does that by increasing the size of the aperture, or simulating that sometimes. Increased size of the aperture. Aperture is also measured really confusingly. It's actually in fractions. So when you see it start with an F, and it might say something like f2.8, that's your aperture size. The larger the number, the smaller the hole. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole. So for example, f1.8 is going to be a really, really big aperture. f32 is really, really tiny. So it's kind of reversed like that. I'm going to show you a scale. So that's aperture. And the third thing is ISO. So let's talk about ISO. ISO, I feel like, is the most straightforward of the three. It is the sensitivity to light. So in other words, it's just how sensitive your sensor is to the light that's coming in, that's hitting it. So you could have your shutter speed, your aperture stay the same, and if you move your ISO, you're going to get a lighter or darker picture. Even though technically there's no more light coming into the camera's being more sensitive to it. So the higher ISO numbers are more sensitive to light. So you can have ISO 100, not very sensitive, really good for outdoor pictures when it's bright, it's sunny. You can have ISO 1600, that's quite high. That's very sensitive, and that's really good for places that are darker, indoors or coming on nighttime, what else? So the secondary effect of ISO is grain or noise. And what that is, it adds sort of a, grainy texture to your picture. The higher it goes, the more grain shows up. Now, this used to be a really important factor. Let's say 10, 15 years ago, it was a really important factor. Now, cameras have gotten really, really good at noise reduction. So even though you're jacking your ISO all the way up to like 3200, it doesn't really matter because the camera's got software to sort of soften it. You're still not going to get the clearest, sharpest picture, but you're going to get a picture, and that's really important. A lot of times people are indoors and they can't use flash, or they can't slow their shutter speed down because their subject is moving, and they can't open up their aperture because maybe their lens is restricted. Your only other option is to up your ISO. So you're going to get a grainy picture, but you're going to get a picture. So I think it's a good trade-off. So those are the three things that make up the exposure triangle. There's no magic numbers. There's no magic settings for your camera. There's no way for me to say if you're shooting in conditions XYZ, then your camera should be on these particular numbers. There's just no such thing. But if you know what each one of those three things does, what it's responsible for, its primary and its secondary function, then you'll know which setting to change in order to affect the change you need to. So, for example, if you're shooting and your picture is too dark, and you need to let in more light, you can do that either by slowing down the shutter speed, opening up the aperture, or raising the ISO, but you need to know what the secondary effect of each of those things is. Anyway, I'm gonna leave it there for now, and I really hope that that was helpful. So if you have any questions, just let me know. I mean, he's just not taking no for an answer, so he's just gonna be sitting with me for this. And they need to be bigger to let more light in. They would be not in focus if my aperture was really big. Right, buddy? Right.